Analyzing the impacts of automatic voter registration in Georgia is the topic of today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with all the registrants in the coming days. Today, you're going to hear from two speakers, David Becker, who's Executive Director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research and the Election Official Legal Defense Network. He's also co-author of the book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. You'll also hear from Ryan Germany, who's former General Counsel for the Georgia Secretary of State and is currently a partner at Gilbert, Harrell, Summerford, and Martin in Atlanta. You can ask a question at any time during the webinar, and we'll make sure that it's answered during the Q&A. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the time allotted. You can ask a question by using the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And there's a control panel that will pop up if you hover your cursor over it. You should not ask a question in the chat box. Use the Q&A box. We'll make sure we get to those. And then if you have a technical question, you can raise your hand and we will connect with you in the chat. Thanks again for joining us. And here's David Becker.
Thanks, Liz. And thank you all for joining us, taking an hour out of your day to talk about this. It's kind of a nuts and bolts wonky issue, but it's one that I know many of us feel very passionately about. How do we have voter lists that are accurately reflective of the actual electorate in any given state, which is often a real challenge. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Ryan Germany, who's former General Counsel at the Georgia Secretary of State's office under both Secretary, now Governor Kemp, and Secretary Raffensperger. And thanks again for being with us, Ryan. And feel free to interrupt me at any point in time, because you have a lot more direct knowledge about this than I do. Why don't we go to the next slide? So first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with CEIR, CEIR is the Center for Election Innovation and Research. We're a 501c3, nonpartisan nonprofit. We work with election officials from all over the country on both sides of the aisle, Republicans, Democrats, everyone, to support elections that voters should and do trust. And unfortunately, even though, as many of you know, we have really succeeded beyond our wildest dreams in terms of the should trust aspect of that, our elections are more secure, transparent, and verified than ever before, thanks to the professionalism amongst election officials. There still remain some aspects of disinformation that are leading people to believe that they should not trust elections. Next slide, please. So we did this study to look at Georgia's automatic voter registration system. And one of the things about automatic voter registrations is that different people and advocates and states define it in different ways. And it often can be perceived to be a politically divisive issue, where certain folks who are more left-leaning might define it a certain way, certain folks who are more right-leaning might define it another way. Whereas really what it's supposed to be is fulfillment of the promise of Section 5 of the National Voter Registration Act, which is about 30 years old, which says that when citizens go and interact with their motor vehicles agency, in Georgia, that's the DDS, but in many places it's called the DMV, that information gets transferred automatically to election officials so they can use it to keep their voter lists up to date and get new voters who might be eligible in their state onto the list in the most efficient and secure way possible. Many states have tried to do this. Some states have tried and succeeded. Georgia, after we've looked at this, I think we can say conclusively they have succeeded on this, and in a way that is really not partisan in any way, that has led to a ton of security enhancements in Georgia specifically. The real big headline here is since Georgia implemented it, automatic voter registration in 2016, their registration rate went up from 78% of eligible voters to 98% in 2020. That's remarkable. It reflects a real efficiency in the system and how it works behind the scenes. Because what we know is, and the reason DMV is so important to election integrity overall, is when people experience a life event, when they come of age, when they change their name or when they move, they know to go to DMV. And the overwhelming majority, might not be exactly 100%, but the overwhelming majority go to DMV to inform DMV of that information. They don't think to do that with elections. Ryan knows this, all election officials know this. What you'll often see is if someone moved in January of 2021, say, election officials might not learn about it until September of 2024, because the election calendar is driving when many people think about updating their voter registrations. And that creates a lot of inefficiencies and integrity issues. So the more that that information can be included in the voter's file at the time of the life event, thanks to automatic voter registration, that's a really good thing for integrity. And we've seen that this increase in Georgia specifically was really driven by the efficiencies created through automatic voter registration at the Department of Driver Services. All right, next slide, please. So one of the other things we're seeing is that as more people find it easy to register or decline to register if they so choose at the DMV, the voter lists start looking more like the eligible population of the state of Georgia, particularly with regard to terms, with regard to age and gender. Whereas younger people might be less likely to register in general, what we're seeing is that, and we'll show you some charts in just a little bit, that we're starting to see that share of the eligible population that's younger be more reflected in the voter lists. And also as a little more balance is created on with regard to gender. Now, this next point is really important because it's a key point for election integrity. And I know Ryan will talk about this a little bit. Inactive records reflect in a voter file a question as to whether or not those individuals are still there in your state eligible to vote. It's really reflective of a lack of information. Maybe a piece of mail didn't get responded to or got returned, not the voter coming to you and saying something. And so inactive records, while an indication that a state is doing good list maintenance, it also means that there might be a more efficient way to either get those people off the lists, because many inactive records, in fact, the vast majority reflect people who moved away, or in those rare cases where you've made a mistake, make sure you've confirmed that they're eligible to be on the list. So after AVR, we saw a huge reduction in the amount of inactive records. 14% of inactive records 14% of the voter list was inactive prior to AVR. That's not a bad percentage. That's probably right around what the average is. That reflects pretty solid list maintenance practices. But that inactive activity rate dropped to just 5% 4 years after its implementation in 2020. And think about how powerful that is. That's largely because the election officials could act in the presence of information rather than the absence of information. And when they can act in the presence of information, they can actually remove people that should be removed. They can actually make sure that people who might have been accidentally inactivated because a piece of mail got returned improperly are properly activated so they don't have any delays at the polling place. It leads to efficiencies in many ways and much better integrity. Next slide, please. So you'll see this on the next slide there, that the share of voter registrations that are coming in through DDS is much higher since AVR. And again, think about why that's a good thing. It means that fewer registrations are coming in via paper forms driven by third-party registration groups and delivered to election officials in Georgia's 159 counties at the last minute, because that's what's always happening. We're going to show you a slide a little bit that demonstrates this. That inefficiency, where paper forms are dumped on election offices really right around the deadline, at the time when they're most busy, when they're recruiting and training poll workers, when they're finding polling places, when they're dealing with military and overseas ballots, that is not the best time to review paper forms and get them input into the system, especially when a lot of them reflect people who are eligible to vote who've been in Georgia for a while, or people who have changed their address, who changed it a while ago. And AVR fixes that problem and reflects the pace of voter registration activity looks a lot more like the pace of life events activity, rather than you seeing big spikes right before a major election, which is what other states often see. Next slide, please. So we did see some things, including a slight increase in an activity rate and a decrease in some registration transactions in the immediate aftermath of 2020. There's a couple of hypotheses around that. We're going to keep looking at it. One is that COVID had some effect on that, and we think that's highly likely. One of the other things that we're going to talk about is, as AVR works better and better, the pool of potential citizens who would like to register, who would choose not to decline, gets smaller and smaller. And so you're going to naturally see diminished returns as a result of the success of AVR. That's not an indication that anything is wrong at all. It just means that most of the people who want to be registered and can be registered are registered. That's a really good thing. Also, you'll see as we talk about this, there were some slight interface changes made in the last few years, and they led to some different results. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to it. And what I mean by interface changes is, what is on the screen? What is the voter themselves reacting to? And sometimes, since citizens aren't thinking about elections like many of us do all the time, sometimes language can be confusing. Sometimes it can be overly legalistic. I've seen this in some other states. And that can cause some confusion and lead voters to do something they didn't intend to do. What you want is something really clear that allows voters who want to be registered to move on in the process of getting registered, and allows voters who, for whatever reason, don't want to be registered to very easily decline and get and move on with their transaction in the DMV. Next slide, please. So this is another key finding, one that is near and dear to Ryan's and my heart, but is probably getting down into the weeds for a lot. But I know for the election officials, this will make a big difference. Georgia has a remarkable level of success, thanks to AVR, in including driver's license numbers and social security numbers in the voter file, in the voter's record. Now, those are not available to the public. Those are just part of the private voter file. But those unique identifiers are incredibly valuable to all kinds of list maintenance activity, to validating mail ballots in Georgia, for instance, and other things to ensure the integrity of the lists. Georgia, I think, we haven't looked at every single state, but I believe Georgia may have the highest rate, and it might be the highest rate by far, of having both of these unique identifiers associated with the voters' records, 97%. And then the remaining 3% have one or the other. So almost every single record has a validator in there. That means a couple of things. Not only, as I mentioned, is it easier to keep up with that voter as they move, as they perhaps do as what I often call aging out of voting as they pass away. But it also allows for, as I said, matching of the mail ballots, and better matching to systems like ERIC, which will enable them to also keep their lists more accurate from a cross-state perspective. Almost every single record has one of those. And it means also that when they presented themselves to get registered, and this is another reason AVR is so good for integrity, I know Ryan will talk about this, they have presented documents at the DDS or at the DMV. They have to in order to get their license. So this isn't a paper voter registration form. They have presented proof of legal status. They have presented proof of residency. They are going through with a licensing transaction that requires that at the same time that they are getting their opportunity to register to vote. So the verification is really strong in Georgia, thanks to AVR. Next slide. All right, here's some of the slides, the charts that I mentioned I wanted to talk about. Here you can see the pace of voter registration in up before 2016 and then post 2016. And you see a very significant increase post 2016, slight decrease in 2022 from 2016. But if you'll note, the general trend in every single state, Georgia is no exception, is that voter registration rates are higher in presidential years than in midterm years. So that's not an unexpected trend that we would expect to see. But note 2018, I think 2018 is a really notable year here. You never see voter registration rates jump from a presidential year to a midterm year. And to jump by 10 points, thanks to AVR, is really remarkable, a huge success story for Georgia. I've never seen that in any other state. So this is this is kind of the registration transactions through the Department of Driver Services, 2014 to 2022. You'll notice we've divided this up to pre-AVR, and then there's 3 different sections for the 3 different interfaces I mentioned. We're not going to get too much into the differences between them, but it does appear that the interface 2 yielded lower results that would probably be unexpected. And as a result, the state, and the DDS in particular, adopted a new interface that seems to be working significantly better. I am personally not surprised that the results are lower in the post-February 2022 period than they might have been in the first few years of AVR, because as I mentioned, Georgia is so successfully registering its eligible voters who want to be registered that it's very natural that you're going to see some decline. This is the y-axis here is overall numbers, not percentages. So you're going to see some decline in the overall numbers. Ryan, do you think that's likely the reason?
Yes. Yeah. At some point, you get full, which is good.
That's great. Okay. So we're gonna move to next one. Okay. So this shows you kind of the monthly new voter registrations, just a different way of looking at the previous data. And what you can see is that pre-AVR, they saw about a little over 12,000 coming through DDS per month. Post AVR in the first interface, that number was more than doubled. Even the second interface was right around where they were pre-AVR. And then the third interface we see is kind of corrected for whatever was happening with the second interface. Again, the fact that those numbers are a little lower, I think, is a natural progression that we would see from states that were successfully registering the voters that wanted to be registered. This is the age parity I was talking about. The blue lines up top are older voters, 65 plus. The orange lines down below are younger voters, 18 to 24. And what you see is the population is the solid line, and the dotted line is the registered voter percentage. And you see both, there's some blips on this, but generally what you're doing is you're seeing the dotted lines convene on the solid lines. As I think most people on this call probably know, older Americans tend to have much higher voter registration rates than younger Americans, but we're starting to see the voter lists accurately reflect what the overall age balance is. And that's a good thing. Now, of course, whether these people choose to vote is up to them and the candidates and the campaigns who might seek to mobilize them. This is just, I often talk about voter registration as it's just getting you to the doorway. Whether you go inside, that's an entirely different choice. Registered voters don't mean voting voters. That is a different measure entirely. So this is the inactive measure that I was talking about before. If we look at this over 2000 to 2022, we see a very significant dip at post AVR. That is not reflecting a lack of list maintenance. In fact, Georgia's list maintenance is as robust as it's ever been. There have been multiple news stories about that. They're taking part in ERIC. They're doing all kinds of things. It just means that they have fewer question mark registrations, which is what an inactive is. We don't know if this person moved or not. Under federal law, a person where there's an indication a person might not be eligible anymore. For instance, a piece of mail got returned or they didn't respond to a mailing. A state can send them an activation notice, but they must remain on the voter list for 2 federal election cycles. That's federal law. And they remain on that list as an inactive voter. And if they happen to show up because that inactivation was an error, they can then be activated again and they will be treated just like a regular voter. The fact that there are fewer inactive voters means there's fewer question marks. It means that election officials have a better idea of who their actual voters are, and they're getting them the right information at their accurate address. Here's a great indication of how we're seeing fewer paper voter registration forms come in. Every one of these DDS transactions, and as you see, they've gone from half of the transactions to 3/4. Those are all those vetted transactions being conducted by a citizen in a DMV, having presented documentation necessary to conduct whatever DMV, DDS transaction they were there to do. And in every DMV that I know of, and I believe this is true in Georgia as well, that requires proof of legal status and proof of residency. This, I'll humbly say, I think this is my favorite chart. Again, since many of us on this webinar are nerds about this kind of stuff. This is the pace of voter registration that I was mentioning. And if you look at the blue line, what you'll see is the spikes that we always would expect. You see three big spikes here, one on 2016, one on 2018, one on 2020. And those are spikes driven by election activity. Those are spikes largely driven by third-party voter registration groups driving paper voter registration activity right before a major election, particularly presidential elections. Now, those have not gone away entirely, although you can see starting, especially around 2022, we're starting to see them go away almost entirely. But look at the orange line. The orange line is registered through DDS, and you'll see that's almost, especially starting from 2016 on, that looks a lot more flat. It's not perfectly flat, but it looks a lot more flat. And that is because life events happen at a much more regular pace. They're not perfect. Birth dates are not spread evenly across a year. For those that are interested, there is an odd spike that happens in late September, early October. If you go 9 months before that, it's right around New Year's Eve, so you can do your own analysis of that. But, and also moves don't happen at a constant rate across the year. They tend to happen a lot around the school cycle. So, however, it's much flatter than the election cycle. And so that's a really good thing. If you're an election official, I know there are some on this call, you want a regular pace of voter registration activity. You do not want to get slammed with a pile of paper at 5 p.m. on the voter registration deadline that you have to take staff to input that data, often by hand, right in the immediate weeks before a major election. Okay, next slide. All right, that's great. So Ryan, I wanted to throw it over to you because you were there and really integral at the start of automatic voter registration in Georgia. And it's often perceived as something that only blue states push. Can you tell us a little bit about the discussions that went on and whether what the data is now showing 7 years later met your expectations about when you were first implementing it?
Sure. Thanks, David. It's great to be here. It's great to be with you guys. And I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this, because a lot of, I think, what we have seen has been unexpected, or at least not the sort of typical expectations that people have when they talk about AVR. So I can definitely take credit for being there. I don't know how integral I was, but I was definitely there. What's the Woody Allen, 90% of success in life is just showing up. So I was there. A lot of the credit, I think, has to go to the Georgia Department of Driver Services. And a lot of the success, I think, that Georgia's AVR has seen is driven by things that happened that were in place really before, well before, in many instances, that September 2016 date of moving to AVR. And I'll say them just quickly for election officials or people who are kind of considering lobbying their states to implement something similar. But first, the Georgia Secretary of State's office and Georgia Department of Driver Services had a very good data sharing platform in place prior to that. And that sounds kind of simple, but it's really not, because you have to have that in place whenever there's a system update at driver services. You have to kind of keep it in place. Whenever there's a system update at SOS, you have to, there's constant working to make sure that data sharing works well. I've heard some states who I won't name, who have moved to AVR without that in place at the beginning, and it just takes so long to implement because they don't have that in place. So that's something that should be in place whether or not you have AVR, and it sounds simple, but it's not, and it takes a lot of work to keep it up. So that's the first thing that I think Georgia had that really laid the groundwork for this. And then secondly, Georgia Department of Driver Services was one of the first states to be fully compliant with the federal Real ID requirements, and that's a huge kind of component of this too, because that goes to what David was talking about, where when you move to Real ID, and I think I'm seeing things in airports now where they're finally kind of saying, okay, everyone has to have a Real ID to fly. Well, in Georgia, every ID issued was Real ID compliant. I think going back to 2012, which was very early in the process. So they moved to that really quickly, and that really increased the security of the of transactions at Department of Driver Services. And so I'll talk quickly about some of the successes that we've seen. I don't know, that there was really an expectation, because we already had that really clear and good data sharing. It wasn't really a big technical change for Georgia. What we saw with some of the successes was is things you wouldn't necessarily think about. But some of them that David mentioned. One, the spreading out of that election work, I think has been, for election officials, has been great, because we definitely used to see that in Georgia, where we had those spikes of paper forms. And not only is it a lot of work, but a lot of those paper forms are not very legible. They don't, there's not as controlled of the accuracy of the information. And it's not just spread out work, but because of kind of the system Georgia has in place, it's very simple to process a voter registration that comes over from DDS. It's basically already kind of typed into the system. You just have to look at it. You kind of get rid of that data input stage. And when you get rid of data input, you get rid of data input errors, which is a great thing to get rid of.
So, one of the points, Ryan, if I could just say real quick, that really strikes me about that as well, is that I don't know that people recognize this, but a lot of paper forms, a huge percentage of them are duplicates. And it's not because anyone's trying to do anything wrong. They just don't remember whether they're registered or not. And so they think, what's the harm? Someone put a form in front of them and they filled it out. And there's no way for the election official to know they're a duplicate until they start entering the information. So there's an inherent inefficiency in workload that happens, because the election official has to enter the information before they know that it's a duplicate, if they even determine it's a duplicate, whereas the DDS avoids that entirely.
Well, so that was one thing that we found. We actually had to sort of do a system kind of update after we implemented AVR, was we still get a lot of duplicates. Now that, I think that's a good thing, because really what that is with AVR, it's somebody saying, hey, I'm still here. They updated their, let's say their license was expiring, but they're still at the same address. So all that comes across as just a, hey, I'm still here. And what happens on the back end in Georgia's voter registration system is their contact date is updated, or it's like, okay, we just made a contact with us, no other changes. At the outset, that was coming over as a voter registration that the county had to process, and it would identify it as a duplicate, but they still had to kind of click through it. Now, I think that they did a system update to say the system just automatically recognizes that as a duplicate, and the election official has to do no work. So we still get the benefit of those duplicates, where it's like, okay, it's kind of confirmation you're still here, without the like David was saying, the workload that's required by county officials. The other success that I think that we've really seen, other than the ones David talked about, and he touched on this one too, was it really increased the quality of data. Practically everyone in Georgia has a driver's license number associated with their voter record. That's a great thing for list maintenance. it allows, I already talked about how we get notified when people are still here, which is good. That's part of list maintenance. But clean data also allows for better data matching with groups like Eric, which allows for better list maintenance and kind of more accurate list maintenance. When we send somebody a mailing now, we can say, hey, here's exactly what we have. Can you confirm this? And we're getting better responses, which I think is allowing that inactive rate to go down, where people instead of just ignoring the mailing will actually respond, and then they can be removed right away.
If I can interrupt for a second, one of the things I remember Gabe Sterling telling me was that thanks to the accurate data, particularly the unique identifiers of driver's license numbers and socials, and the partnership with Eric getting you data from other states that told you whether someone with the same social and date of birth and name and maybe something else got a driver's license in another state. One of the things Georgia was really successful at was not just contacting them at their old Georgia address, but contacting them at their new address and actually getting them to confirm that they had moved out of Georgia at very high rates. I think he said about 18% of mailings resulted in a voter confirming it directly. And I mentioned the inactive status under the National Voter Registration Act, where you have to hold a registration on for 2 federal election cycles. If a voter themselves confirm that they've moved out of your state or is no longer eligible, the NVRA says you can remove them right away. And so that's incredibly powerful information. I think it's one of the reasons the inactive rates have gone down, because instead of voters who would otherwise have been left on as inactive, you've actually been able to remove them under the law and accurately.
And that all starts with having good, accurate information on the front end. So you got to have good information on the voter registration to then match it with Eric, to then tailor a communication to that voter to say, hey, here's the situation that we see. And when you're a voter and you see that, it allows you to say, oh, yep, that's right. Whereas if you don't have as good of data, you might require more of the voter, and then all of a sudden they're just not doing it. So I think that's exactly right. The other thing it allowed us to do was, we're one of my many things that happened when I was general counsel was we got sued a lot by people on the left, by people on the right, and it got to where both of them were complaining about signature matching, verifying voters through signature matching. So having these driver's license numbers at a very, very high rate allowed us to move really smoothly to an ID-based absentee by mail verification system that we have actually seen works quite well. And I think the Carter Center did some observations, and they said that the verification was really smooth and, frankly, again, easier. Moving to that objective ID-based standard was easier for election officials than trying to do signature matching.
Yeah, and another thing, because I know it's often, look, I mean, it's very easy to retreat into partisan camps on election policy, but that was one of those things. Minnesota does something very similar to what Georgia just implemented. And it's one thing, look, if a state only had driver's license numbers associated with 50 or 60% of its records, I think there could be legitimate concerns raised about what you're going to do with the people who don't have a driver's license number on their record. But here we're talking about a state, Georgia, where 97, 98, 99% of them have a driver's license number associated. And I should also say the percentage that don't are probably among the least likely to choose to vote by mail. So you're really talking about a system that is going to expedite verification of ballots in a way that no one gets accidentally disenfranchised because their signature doesn't look like when they first signed their driver's license or their voter registration form, and no potentially fraudulent ballot gets through because of slipshod signature matching. Here you've got an objective measure, driver's license number. It's what the voter has in their pocket looking at their driver's license.
And in Georgia, we have options for people that don't have a driver's license number, but it's much kind of easier to process for the county if they do. And so it works, you've got to have a system for folks that don't, but to the extent you can kind of get as many people as possible through the kind of, system A, then that makes it easier for election officials not just from operations, but also from training and, really, really doing all those things. One other thing that I think doesn't get talked about a lot In Georgia, we do citizenship verification, and at DDS, it is seamless for the voter, right? I mean, it's something they're already having to show in that transaction, with documentary proof, and it makes that verification seamless. And so, I think even if you look at other states that do citizenship verification, I think ours is probably kind of the highest percent and also the most seamless for voters, which is great. Let's not make them show something that they've already showed.
Can I
The
just
other thing,
Ryan,
yes,
real
please.
quick? I think that's a really great point, because again, citizenship verification has become kind of a partisan issue. And, there are legitimate concerns about placing burdens on voters that might be difficult, but there are also legitimate concerns about non-citizens, maybe either accidentally or even intentionally, in very rare cases, registering. At DMV, you're already bringing your proof of legal status. And for the vast majority of people at DMV, and I've been working with DMVs all over the country for a long time, that is a citizenship document. It's usually a birth certificate or a passport. Those are the overwhelming top ones that are being brought in every single DMV. And if you've got a birth certificate or a passport, a United States birth certificate or passport in your file, that's incredibly powerful. I mean, there's no more questions about citizenship at that point. There's always the question about how you incorporate data from people who might have been recently naturalized, and that's a separate issue. And a lot of states do things, and I think Georgia does this too, often reaching out to naturalization ceremonies and things like that. But if you can this goes back to your point about the signature matching, if you don't have a driver's license number, if you can get 95+% of the people through that process at a natural point in time when they're already bringing their documentation and it's not an additional burden to them, that's such an advantage for election officials.
Yes, that's right. And kind of for the other people, Georgia works with SAVE through the federal government for citizenship verification, but that's a much more sort of individual process. And so the fact that pretty much everyone's being verified through DDS, where it's seamless, and you have that, and in Georgia, you have to show your proof of legal status to get a driver's license. And so they're either showing their citizenship or they're showing other documentation that proves that they're not a citizen. So like if when we get a non-citizen from DDS, that's kind of good data too. So it really works well on both ends. I think the final thing we've seen, it's kind of going to some of the spreading out of the work that David was talking about. Oh, one thing I'll say too, we talked about the duplicates before I get to this final one, is, there was that interface 2 change that David talked about where the kind of opt-outs went, frankly, higher than they had been. I haven't gotten to the weeds on that. I think that what a lot of that might have been was actually things that would have been duplicates saying, well, no, I don't need this to be part of my registration, and basically opting out because of that. Again, we like those duplicates because it's just kind of a, hey, I'm still here, and the system is built so they can be pretty seamless. But if you're a voter and you say, I haven't moved, I don't need to update my voter registration, you might just say no. But the fourth thing I want to talk about is really important, and it goes to the decrease in paper forms. One of the biggest areas of fraud that we've seen in Georgia, when I was at SOS, was with voter registration fraud on paper forms. Whether it's forgeries or things like that, and it's usually tied to groups that are trying to do things around elections. There's usually a, hey, you need to get this number per day, and so it kind of incentivizes some of that. And with decreasing kind of the need for that, which I think we've really effectively done in Georgia, has basically really gotten rid of the incentive to do that, to even have those types of kind of groups going out there in large form. And what we've done is we've replaced it with a transaction that's highly secure, highly accurate, much easier for election officials to process. And I think the benefits that David mentioned are ones that I think people really talk about when they're talking about AVR, But I think these other things, especially from an election official standpoint in terms of their day-to-day, and I think as we've all come to appreciate, their day-to-day is a lot more than I think people realized. So when we can do stuff like this to really just try to make that part a little bit easier, I think we can really lead to elections that are smoother, higher integrity, and more confidence in the result.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan. Liz, do we want to go to some of the questions?
We do indeed. One thing I just want to correct that I said in the beginning, I said that this event was being held with Protect Democracy. While we've held other events with Protect Democracy, this one is being hosted solo by CEIR. So the first question we have is representative of kind of a stream of questions on opting out. So Stan Ward from the Maryland General Assembly asks, are applicants offered an opportunity to opt out of voter registration at the point of service or after the fact?
I can handle that one. In Georgia, their opportunity to opt out is at the point of service. One thing that is very state dependent is we do not have partisan registration in Georgia, so you don't have to identify a political party. So at DDS, that's all the information that's needed. I know in some states they have to kind of follow up and see, well, what party do you want to be registered in? But in Georgia, it's point of service, opt out, and then that's all the voter has to do. They're done after that.
And I'll just add, I mean, there's different models. They're called different things. They're often wrapped up in some partisan rhetoric on either side. I happen to be of the opinion that it should be easy for eligible voters to register, and it should also be easy for eligible voters to choose not to register. And point of service is a nice way of doing that. This is where the interface question comes in. You want to make sure the interface, in other words, the language that the voter is interacting with is understandable to them and they know what they're choosing to do. But if you can get over that hurdle, I think point of service works really well. And it's especially important in states, and Ryan alluded to this, where there is partisan registration. Because what you don't want is a whole lot of registrants getting automatically registered without a party identifier, especially where you have closed primaries and they might not get a ballot that's relevant to them. This is less important in states like Georgia, which has quasi-open primaries. I don't know if we call it that, in that any voter can choose to vote in either the Republican or Democratic primary. Or in states like California or Washington, where you have a top two primary and everyone gets the same ballot regardless of party preference. But in states that have closed primaries by party, you want to capture that information at the point of service because you don't want someone to accidentally be disenfranchised in a primary.
Okay, next question is from Robert Harper. When a registered voter moves to a new address within the state and they update their driver's license, does the voter roll get updated, deleted from one voter location and added to a new voter location?
Yes, the short answer is yes, that's exactly what happened. What happens. And it's easier to do now that, with AVR, because then there's really no doubt that that voter is the same person. And you can just update that record. For instance, prior to that, if a voter moved and sent in a paper application, they might not use the exact same name. My first name is Charles. I go by Ryan. I could do something like that, and the election official might not recognize it as a duplicate or as the same voter that should just be moved to a different county or taken from their previous county. But that's a great point too. That's another kind of, I think, just benefit of the better data. It makes it easier to identify when a same voter is updating their address, because previously, and there still are some where the same voter will have two records because an election official didn't recognize it as the same voter. But with AVR, I think you see that very much decrease.
Yeah, I'll just add something really quickly. First of all, for those of you that are, doctors of election nerd history, prior to about almost 20 years ago, virtually no states had a single state voter database. These voter databases resided in each individual county. In a state like Georgia, that has second most counties in the country, 159 of them. That meant there were 159 different databases or file cabinets. They might be digital file cabinets, but they were still file cabinets. And so you needed to, to coordinate all of that information transfer was really hard and often didn't work particularly well. The statewide voter registration database that resulted from the Help America Vote Act around 2005, 2006, led to states actually consolidating all of that in one place. But states are still moving to more efficient voter registration databases. Georgia's did that actually with their new voter database called Jarvis. That is, I think, and Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, going to be much more efficient to make sure that any eligible voter in Georgia will have one record in Georgia at any given point in time, even as they move between counties.
Yes, yeah, we're in process of implementing Jarvis, which is a new voter registration system, and you always have to kind of stay up to date on this stuff. So our previous system did have that functionality too, and then the hope is with the new system that functionality is going to work even better, and I think that it will.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I think we were talking about in-state there. That was a really good question. I also want to talk about when someone moves out of state. One of the challenges is a state like Georgia, if someone moved to, let's say, Illinois, there's no way for Georgia to know that information. That person might have gone and gotten an Illinois driver's license. There's a misperception that the DMVs are talking to each other much better than they are. They're not talking to each other that well. Even if they surrender a license, it might not get back to Georgia DMV or DDS rather. And in many states, although Georgia's DDS talks really well with the Secretary of State's office, many states the DMV doesn't talk well with the election office. So there might be several breakdowns in that. And that's why, with the information that they have from AVR in each individual's record and their membership in ERIC, Georgia will get information. Someone moves from Atlanta to Chicago and gets a driver's license. Within 60 days, probably Georgia's going to get a notice that we think this person moved because they have a more recent activity in another state's DMV. And this is back to your point, by the way, Ryan, about activity dates, like knowing that they came in and taught, and we often call them touches, that they're a touch to the data. You can know which was the most recent, and that's really important. And they can not only know that they got a driver's license in Illinois, but they'll actually tell them, here's an address for them in Illinois if you want to mail them something, and see if they'll take their information off the records. And that the power of that data is something that states that aren't in ERIC don't get, obviously, because the cross-state data is something that states never have access to, certainly with the kind of secure, unique identifiers that will now allow them to say with certainty that the Ryan Germany who just got Charles Germany, right, just got a license in another state is the same as the one that you have in your state. That might not be that unusual for Charles Ryan Germany. It might be really tough to do when you're talking about John Lee or Maria Rodriguez or Sean O'Hara, where there's a lot of common names and a lot of fuzzy name matching, and also people with the same name and birth date.
And one other benefit to that is we get that in Georgia, in that scenario, we would get that data quicker due to our membership in ERIC than we did prior to that, because we if the person did a change of address form, we would have gotten that data eventually from USPS. That's not, it's not the same sort of, I think, quality of data in terms of here's the touch in Illinois, here's the address, and it allows us to be more timely in our communications, so that I think that timeliness increases the percentage of the voter responding to the communication.
This is such a key point. One thing, when people often talk about the Postal Service and the National Change of Address form, we have to remember a couple of things. First of all, a relatively small percentage of people fill those out. It's more likely to be people who are homeowners, not necessarily renters. But one thing that's true for all of those forms, they don't contain any unique identifiers on them. You don't put your driver's license number on a National Change of Address form. You don't put your birth date. You don't put your Social Security number on. In fact, that would probably not be a good idea to require all of that information on it. It's just a place for Postal Service to know your mail should be forwarded to. It's serving a different purpose. So to be able to get that information directly from the source, like the DMV in another state, which has all of that information, is really important to matching. It's even important, for instance, to matching deaths, because oftentimes people who've died, and many states get that off of the Social Security death list, that might not have a current address on it. It might be old address data. They're definitely not going to have a driver's license number on there. They might have social. So if states only have driver's license numbers and not many socials, it's going to be really hard to match that with certainty. And I will tell you, I've yet to meet a single election official, I don't care how conservative or liberal they are, that want to accidentally remove a live voter from the list accidentally thinking they're dead. Because those people have a tendency to show up at the polls. And for some reason, local news is always there when that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, people are really careful about that, because unlike the moves that I mentioned under the National Voter Registration Act, states can just remove someone who is dead, but they all take an extreme amount of care with that power to make sure they're not accidentally removing someone mistakenly believing that they've died.
Who's not dead yet.
Right. Good
Okay,
news.
we have a number of questions about teenagers. So I'm going to read one of those off. So we've got one from Ned Jones from the Election Integrity Network and the Conservative Partnership Institute. He is wondering, how do election officials know when a person turns 18? And then we've got a second question asking if 16-year-olds, when they get a driver's license, are automatically registered to vote.
So in Georgia, you can pre-register when you're 17 and a half years old. And if you go to DDS and you're 17 and a half or have an interaction with DDS, then you would be able to pre-register. Now, you can't then vote in an election until unless you would be 18 in that election. But for instance, if you're going to be 18, in October 2024, you can register to vote in that November election 6 months before your birthday. So for people that are younger than that, for 16-year-olds, for instance, when they go to DDS, they're not eligible voters. So they're not included in they're not even given the opportunity to kind of opt in or out, because DDS has already identified them as they're not eligible voters. In the same way that someone who DDS identifies as a non-citizen, they're not even given that opportunity because they've been shown at that point to be not eligible.
Yeah, that's a great point. So often we talk about people who are ineligible to vote, and we often go right to the citizenship. The largest group is the people who are not 18 yet. I believe the majority of states, a large number of states, offer pre-registration, meaning that a record is created at some point, some as early as 16, some 17 and a half. A record is created, but it is not activated. It is. And the first part of the question that was asked was a really good one. It's one of the easier challenges for election officials. How do you know when someone becomes eligible due to age? Well, every single voter registration record in the United States of America has a birth date attached to it. Every single one. And so there's a natural clock that as soon as 12:01 hits on someone's birth date, you can set up a system automatically to automatically activate them, and even to send out a notice, as many states do, to say, hey, congratulations, you're now a registered voter, and you can participate in the process. So it's a fairly easy system to set up, not expressing any policy preferences on whether 16 or 17 and a half. But I think most states that have pre-registration like it, because people go in at some point for reasons associated with their driver's license, get their records into the system, and the system can be set up to automatically process those based on birth date.
And in Georgia, it's not like, let's say you go get your license when you're 16, which, as a former 16-year-old boy, I can't believe we still do that, give them driver's licenses. But it's not like when you turn 17 and a half, you're activated or anything like that. You would have to have an interaction when you're 17 and a half or older to kind of start that process.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up because we're out of time. This has been a really engaged group. Thank you so much for joining and for submitting so many questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to every one of them. Please keep reading the newsletter, because there's going to be more, there will be more webinars and events like this that CEIR will be doing in the coming weeks and months. Be sure to also follow David Becker on Twitter at Becker David J, and CEIR on Twitter at Election Innov. Keep in touch with us, and we'll hopefully see you next time. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Ryan, for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.